The autumn leaves danced like embers in the crisp air as Jonathan hurried across the campus, his breath visible in the chilly morning. The world seemed to shimmer with a golden hue, matching the excitement that coursed through him. It was the first day of Professor Ilara Monroe's seminar on romantic literature, a class that had become the talk of the university for its enigmatic instructor and the passionate discussions it inspired. Jonathan had always been a dedicated student, his life a tapestry woven with books and the quiet solitude of his studies. But something about Ilara Monroe had captured his imagination long before he set foot in her classroom. Her reputation as a brilliant scholar and a captivating lecturer preceded her, and the rumors of her mysterious past only added to her allure. As he entered the lecture hall, the room buzzed with anticipation. Students settled into their seats, their eyes fixed on the podium where Ilara would soon stand. Jonathan found a spot near the front, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and excitement. When Ilara entered, the room seemed to hold its breath. She was a vision of grace and intellect, her auburn hair cascading over her shoulders like a waterfall of autumn leaves. Her eyes, a deep shade of emerald, scanned the room with an intensity that made each student feel as though they were the only one in the room. "Good morning," she began, her voice a melody that resonated through the hall. "Today, we embark on a journey through the landscapes of the heart, exploring the depths of human emotion as expressed through the words of the great romantics." Jonathan was entranced. Her words were like poetry, each sentence a brushstroke painting vivid images in his mind. As she spoke, he found himself drawn not just to her intellect, but to the passion that radiated from her every word. The class flew by in a whirlwind of discussion and debate, and as it ended, Jonathan lingered, hoping for a moment to speak with her. He approached the podium, his heart in his throat. "Professor Monroe," he began, his voice tentative, "I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed your lecture. It was inspiring." Ilara turned to him, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that made his heart skip a beat. "Thank you, Jonathan," she replied, her voice a gentle caress. "I'm glad you found it inspiring. I look forward to hearing your thoughts as the semester progresses." Their conversation was brief, but it left Jonathan with a sense of connection, a spark that ignited a longing he couldn't quite define. As the weeks passed, Jonathan found himself eagerly anticipating each class, his mind consumed by thoughts of Ilara. He devoured the texts they studied, his essays growing more passionate and insightful with each assignment. Ilara noticed, her comments on his work filled with praise and encouragement. One afternoon, after a particularly intense discussion on the nature of love, Ilara asked Jonathan to stay behind. The room was quiet, the air thick with the scent of old books and the fading light of the setting sun. "Jonathan," she said, her voice soft, "I've been impressed with your work. You have a unique perspective, a depth of understanding that is rare. I was wondering if you would be interested in meeting to discuss some ideas I have for a research project." Jonathan's heart soared. "I would love that," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. They arranged to meet in her office the following afternoon. As Jonathan left the lecture hall, he felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with a hint of trepidation. He knew that spending time alone with Ilara would only deepen his feelings for her, but he couldn't resist the pull he felt towards her. The next day, Jonathan arrived at Ilara's office, his heart pounding. She greeted him with a warm smile, gesturing for him to take a seat. The room was filled with books, the walls lined with shelves that seemed to hold the wisdom of the ages. The next day, Jonathan arrived at Ilara's office, his heart pounding. She greeted him with a warm smile, gesturing for him to take a seat. The room was filled with books, the walls lined with shelves that seemed to hold the wisdom of the ages. As they discussed the research project, their conversation flowed effortlessly, moving from academic discourse to more personal topics. Ilara spoke of her travels, her experiences, and the passions that drove her. Jonathan listened, captivated by her stories and the way she spoke with such fervor and conviction. Their meetings became a regular occurrence, each one a treasure trove of intellectual and emotional discovery. Jonathan found himself opening up to Alara in ways he never had with anyone else, sharing his dreams, his fears, and the thoughts that often kept him awake at night. Alara, in turn, revealed glimpses of her own soul, her vulnerabilities hidden beneath a veneer of strength and confidence. She spoke of the challenges she had faced, the sacrifices she had made, and the loneliness that sometimes threatened to overwhelm her. Their connection deepened, a bond forged in the crucible of shared experiences and mutual understanding. But with each meeting, the tension between them grew, a silent current of longing that neither dared to acknowledge. One evening, as they sat in Alara's office, the room bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp, the air crackled with an unspoken energy. Jonathan felt a pull towards her, a magnetic force that drew him closer. "Alara," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I feel like there's something between us, something more than just a student-teacher relationship." Alara looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret. "Jonathan," she replied, her voice tender, "I won't deny that I feel it too. But we must be careful. The rules of academia, the expectations, they complicate things." Jonathan nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. But the seed of hope had been planted, a flicker of possibility that refused to be extinguished. As the semester drew to a close, their relationship evolved into a delicate dance of restraint and desire. They navigated the challenges of secrecy, their connection, a secret world that existed just beyond the boundaries of the everyday. One afternoon, as they walked through the campus gardens, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers, Alara turned to Jonathan, her eyes shining with a quiet intensity. "Jonathan," she said, her voice a gentle caress, "I want you to know that you have become very important to me." But Jonathan held his breath, the weight of Alara's words sinking into his chest. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the battle between duty and desire. His mind raced with thoughts of what could be, what should be, and what was forbidden. But the spark between them had already ignited a fire, and no matter how much they tried to suppress it, it burned relentlessly in the spaces between their words, in the lingering glances, in the unspoken thoughts they dared not voice aloud. Alara let out a quiet sigh and turned her gaze to the horizon. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of amber and violet, as if nature itself understood the bitter sweetness of their predicament. "I've spent my life walking a careful line, Jonathan," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've built my career on discipline, on maintaining boundaries. But you've made me question everything I thought I knew about restraint." Jonathan swallowed hard, his hands clenching at his sides. "I don't want to make things difficult for you, Alara," he murmured, "but I also can't ignore what I feel." She met his gaze then, her emerald eyes brimming with unspoken emotions. "Neither can I," she confessed, "but we must be careful. The world won't be kind to us if we cross that line." Jonathan nodded, but deep down he knew there was no turning back. What had started as admiration had grown into something far more powerful, and despite the consequences, he wasn't willing to let it fade into the realm of unfulfilled longing. Days turned into weeks, and their stolen moments became a dangerous game of proximity and restraint. Every glance held a secret, every brush of fingertips was electric, and every conversation was laced with an undercurrent of yearning that neither of them could ignore. One evening, after another captivating lecture, Alara found herself lingering in the empty classroom, her thoughts tangled in the complexity of her emotions. She hadn't noticed Jonathan waiting by the door until he cleared his throat. "Professor Monroe," he began, the formality of her title sounding foreign between them now. "Would you allow me to walk you home tonight?" She hesitated, knowing full well that accepting would be another step closer to something irreversible. But as she looked at him, at the quiet intensity in his gaze, she found herself nodding. The walk was slow, filled with hushed conversation and gentle laughter. They spoke of poetry and philosophy, of dreams and regrets, of the fleeting nature of time and the aching beauty of forbidden love. By the time they reached her doorstep, the air between them was thick with tension. "Would you like to come in for tea?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jonathan hesitated only for a moment before nodding. "I'd like that." Inside, the warmth of her home enveloped him, the scent of aged books and sandalwood, the soft glow of lamplight casting long shadows on the walls. As Ilara busied herself in the kitchen, Jonathan wandered to the bookshelves, running his fingers over the spines of well-worn volumes. "You have quite the collection," he mused, as she returned with 2 cups of steaming tea. She smiled, setting the cups down on the small wooden table. "Books have always been my refuge," she admitted. "A place where I could lose myself and forget the constraints of reality." Jonathan watched her carefully, sensing that her words held deeper meaning. "And now?" he asked softly. "Are you still trying to escape reality?" Ilara looked at him for a long moment before shaking her head. "No," she said quietly, "not anymore." Silence settled between them, heavy and charged. Jonathan could feel his heartbeat in his throat, his body tense with the awareness of her nearness. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, she stepped closer. "Jonathan," she whispered, his name a confession on her lips. He reached for her then, his hands gentle as they cupped her face. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, giving her one last chance to walk away. But she didn't. Instead, she closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was slow and aching, a culmination of weeks of unspoken desire. The moments stretched into eternity, a quiet surrender to the inevitable. That night they talked for hours, their souls unraveling in whispers and confessions. They spoke of fears and hopes, of the risks they were taking, of the love that had blossomed between them in the shadows of academia. As dawn approached, Jonathan traced lazy patterns along her bare shoulder, his heart filled with a quiet certainty. "What happens now?" he asked. Ilara sighed, nestling closer. "We take it one day at a time," she said. "We navigate this together." And so they did. Days turned into months, and their love grew in secret, hidden behind closed doors and hushed conversations. They met in stolen moments, in quiet libraries and moonlit gardens, in whispered poetry and lingering touches. The world saw only a professor and her student, but they knew better. They knew of love written in margins, of hearts beating in unison, of a connection that defied the confines of rules and expectations. But love, no matter how carefully hidden, has a way of revealing itself. One evening, as Jonathan waited for Ilara in her office, the door burst open, and there stood Dean Wallace, his expression thunderous. "Professor Monroe," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. "Is there something you'd like to explain?" Jonathan and Ilara exchanged a glance, their secret world teetering on the edge of exposure. Ilara began, but before she could speak, Jonathan stepped forward. "It's my fault," he said quickly. "I've been seeking extra guidance, and I may have overstepped professional boundaries." The dean's sharp gaze shifted between them. "I certainly hope that's all this is," he said coldly. "The university has a reputation to uphold. I trust there won't be any further reason for concern." Ilara nodded, her face carefully composed. "Of course, Dean Wallace." As he left, Jonathan exhaled, turning to her. "That was close." She nodded, but her eyes were filled with worry. "We need to be more careful." But fate, as it often does, had other plans. One afternoon, an anonymous letter arrived on the dean's desk, detailing the truth of their relationship. The repercussions were swift and unforgiving. Ilara was called into a disciplinary hearing, her career hanging by a thread. Jonathan was summoned as well, forced to face the weight of their choices. As they sat in the cold, impersonal office, their hands clasped beneath the table, Ilara met his gaze with quiet determination. "No matter what happens, Jonathan," she whispered, "I don't regret a single moment." Neither did he. In the end, Ilara resigned before the university could dismiss her, choosing dignity over disgrace. Jonathan, heartbroken but resolute, followed her into the unknown, unwilling to let their love be dictated by rules and expectations. They left the university behind, stepping into a future uncertain but full of possibility. They built a life together, one of passion and literature, of late-night discussions and early morning embraces, of a love that had defied the odds and survived. And in the end, as they sat in a small cafe years later, their hands intertwined over a worn copy of Keats' poetry, Jonathan smiled. "Ilara," he said softly, "our story, it was always meant to be written." And so it was. A love story, against all odds.